Hello everyone. Today I have a very special video for you all, and it's a book review. And it is going to be a review of The Radiant King by David Dalglish. This is a brand new release. I believe it dropped about a week ago as of the uploading of this video. So thanks to Orbit and NetGalley for letting me have an arc of this book. Sorry it's not out quite on time, but better late than never. But I knew nothing about this book going in. Patrick Leo mentioned it in one of his videos way back in October, and just the cover looked interesting to me. Knew nothing else about it and added it to a list of books I wanted to read, one of my most anticipated books of the year, just on that cover, and so jumped at the chance of being able to read an advanced reader copy, and boy was I glad that I did. So what is this book about? So The Radiant King is primarily about, in this fantasy world, there are 6 immortal siblings that possess the gift of radiance. And radiance is the primary magic of this world. It allows them to do all sorts of things, from being able to increase their own strength, create fire, stop fire, manipulate people, shift their personality ever so slightly, or influence their minds in small or very minute ways. Really, it's a very soft magic if we want to use those classifications in terms of what radiance can do. But the primary thing about these 6 siblings, the main characters that we follow through this novel, is, like I mentioned, they're immortal. They do not die. Well, they die, but they resurrect relatively quickly and come back in their current form. In this world, we get the impression about halfway through the novel that there's some sort of reincarnation at play, that souls, when they die, come back in different forms. But for these 6 siblings, they maintain all of their memories, which is not true of everyone else. They know fully who they are, and they are very much interrelated as they are siblings. Sort of the jumping off point of this novel is that many, many years ago, the relationships between these siblings fell apart. Chaos came in their relationships, but also to the land itself. And through some very disastrous mistakes and some very large-scale consequences that came about, these siblings took a vow. They took an oath never to reign over mankind and never to have crowns of their own. And then when the novel truly begins, though, one of these brothers awakens from one of his immortality rebirths that the novel opens with. And when he awakens, he learns very quickly that one of his brothers has sort of been estranged from the other ones, that he has broken his vow, he's broken the oath that was sworn before, and that he's begun not only a blood cult, but also has claimed a crown for himself. And that he's seeking power. He seeks to awaken some sort of deep, eldritch, mystical power from this massive tower, this ancient tower that is in the center of one of the large kingdoms in the land. And so, not only this brother who's recently awakened, but he also joins up with one of his brothers that he's estranged with to seek to stop this one who has gone rogue, who's broken the oaths. They join up with a mercenary group and go off to a war that's not their own. They face many dangers, but also are trying to gather the siblings that have fallen away over the many years, centuries even, that they've dispersed, to try to stop this one rogue brother that could cause untold amounts of damage and destruction, not just to the siblings, but to the world as a whole. The first thing to mention about The Radiant King is that there is a lot packed into this book. The best way that I can say is that there is a trilogy's worth of material just in this first novel. If you ever read a trilogy and you think like, man, this is kind of stretched thin, it seems like they're really pushing the concept far, this book has the opposite effect. Dalglish writes with a very terse and direct and to the point writing style. I was trying to think of exactly what it reminds me of. I came up with Jack Vance, Paul Anderson, even Le Guin, some of these older authors, but really the best example is Robert E. Howard, famously Solomon Kane and Conan the Barbarian stories. And with Robert E. Howard, what many of his fans will describe it as is that in a short story, Howard is able to pack in enough world building and character and story that you would normally get in an entire fantasy novel, but he gets it into the 30-40 pages of a short story. That's very applicable over this novel, but with the idea of it being a trilogy. A trilogy's worth of action and events and world building and conflict happens in just this one novel. So if you take, like, this is a collection of the Conan, of some of the Conan stories, and this is just one Conan story. And that's like essentially a novel's worth of material there. So think the same idea, but apply it out onto the scale of a trilogy. Dalglish, it's not that he rushes the book, there are very long sections and long portions of the book where he takes his time when it's needed, but then there are other places in the book where he's very sharp and very to the point. And he doesn't waste his time, which as a reader, I appreciate, especially since this isn't an overly long fantasy novel, but it's not terribly short either. So an example of this is in one part of the book, he describes the meeting of two characters who are romantically involved, and then the next paragraph later talks about how they were shortly married thereafter. So one paragraph, and he goes from meeting to marriage and then moves on. And because of that, he's able to tell a lot more story in this and cut a lot of the fluff and a lot of the padding that you get in this genre. That's one of the problems that we see, especially with modern speculative fiction novels and sci-fi fantasy novels, is many authors almost feel an obligation to have their books be massive tomes. And Dalglish is kind of flying in the face of that, showing that you can have a story with this epic scope and all these characters and all the weird ways that magic and world building is used, but still keep things without the unnecessary padding that many of these novels have. Another thing to point out is that his writing style is very modern. It's not flowery. It's not, it's not Patrick Rothfuss. It's not Robin Hobb. But it's useful. It does what it's designed to do. Especially it shines in its action sequences. Dalglish does these very, very well. There's very creative uses of magic. It's a very soft magic. There's a lot of flexibility in terms of what radiance can do. And so these can feel like very overpowered beings. But the way that the siblings, especially two of the main characters are the brothers Farron and Sariel, and the way that they use their magic in times of war or in fights is very creative and very inventive. Especially you think of it if you have two warriors in your army who are immortal, who have some sort of magic power. They can't die, they can't be killed, not in the traditional sense at least. And what are the ways that you could use that to your advantage during wartime? And Dalglish uses that idea in some very creative ways throughout this novel. He also has some very interesting fantasy creatures while we're talking about world building. He does some very interesting things with dragons. If you remember in the How to Train Your Dragon movies, they have some very concrete rules for how dragons operate and the way they fire and the way that their mannerisms are. Dalglish has a similar type of thing here with some of the dragons and some of the other creatures where it's almost like the people have studied them in a scientific way and are able to analyze the best ways to combat with these other beasts, but dragons are a key one that I felt like were used very, very well. And he also uses radiance in some very twisted ways as well, to show not just that this is a power that can be used in war, but it can also have a very harmful effect on humans. It can be used to deform and destroy even the human body, and some of the ways that that's used is quite creative, if not dark. And while we're talking about tone, this book's tone is very difficult to nail down, because for most of the novel, it reads with the tone, or I'd say maybe 70% of the novel, it reads like it has the tone of like a book by Robert Jordan, or even, dare I say, Brandon Sanderson. And then there are sobering moments where it shifts, and it seems like Kentaro Miura or Cormac McCarthy have picked up the pen. I would say McCarthy's especially a good example of that, where it goes from being heroic to being viscerally dark, soberingly dark. And so it's hard to classify, because if you go into this expecting a grimdark novel, if you want to use that term, for the first like 20-30% of the novel, you're like, what? Like this, what is this, lighthearted stuff? But it gets dark in places. And if you're looking for a lighthearted, fun, heroic, happy, adventure fantasy novel, this is going to be much darker than what you're looking for. Since I mentioned Berserk, I'm going to talk about that, and I allude to this in the thumbnail as well. This book is heavily inspired by Berserk. I was queued up for this near the beginning of the novel, where one of the brothers is sort of this lone wanderer throughout the mysterious land, and he's got a large black cloak and carries a freaking massive sword across his back. And I was like, that's kind of interesting. Well, it could be a coincidence. Maybe I'm jumping at things. And it would be about every 30 to 50 pages or so, there would be another thing, whether it's a tip of the hat or sort of a wink, or something that was very similar in terms of the themes or even some world building things from Berserk, where it became pretty clear that Dalglish took a lot of inspiration from that. Now, this is not as dark as Berserk. I know I alluded to that a second ago, but for the majority of this book, this is not as dark as Miura gets with his book, but you have things like the Lone Stranger, the big sword, traveling through this unknown land, not knowing what's going to happen in the next weird, absurd village in the dark forest, what creatures you could encounter, things with fairies, different things like that remind you of the way Berserk handles its world building and how it gradually expands as well, and some of the eldritch, darker horror elements that Berserk has as well. And I'll leave that pretty vague to keep this spoiler free. And then some of the mercenary parts of this book were similar to elements of the Golden Age arc from Berserk. So fans of Berserk should check this novel out. I think there's a lot of surface level world building things that are interesting and that people will connect with and enjoy, but also for some of the deeper themes and bigger questions that are asked. Because like I said, even though this book begins with a very heroic frame of mind and a very heroic presentation, this is a dark world, and some of the things that people have to go through, and especially some of the siblings have to go through, is very sobering. I mean, you think about it. These siblings are immortal. They have watched many, many generations live, grow up, and die around them. I mentioned a second ago that there's some element of reincarnation in the world, and the way that Dalglish plays with that, and the fact that these siblings aren't reincarnated, they're just immortal, was really interesting. So, for example, one of the characters is in love with a single soul, and he's traced this soul across all generations. Sometimes takes him a while to find, but for every generation, he sought this one specific soul out in all of its various forms and pursued it, fallen in love, and been in a relationship with it. So they've witnessed the same soul live, love, and die across centuries. And the weight that causes for this sibling and the weight that they have to bear is something that's really explored in a very interesting way. There's a lot in this book. You think of the amount of suffering that people deal with in our lives of 70, 80 years, and you think of that suffering expanded over the course of centuries of having to live and see the way that people deal with one another, seeing the way that people war with one another, seeing some of the dark, twisted creatures that are in this world. That does a lot to a person, especially to an immortal person. And so there's a lot of questions about how do you deal with suffering? How do you carry that burden? And the normal question that's asked in a lot of these types of situations is, where was God? And a question of man searching for God. But this book, honestly, it takes that question and it flips it. Rather than being about man's search for God, in a lot of ways this book is about God searching for man. Because the main villain, the sibling who has gone rogue, one of their main motivations is that they believe firmly that their creator, that God, has forgotten them, has gotten lost, and no longer knows where humanity is. And so one of their goals is to guide God back to mankind, to help God find man, rather than the opposite of man finding God. So that's a really interesting question or idea that Dalglish plays with in this novel. But a lot of very universal things that I said Berserk also uses, questions of how do you bear the load of suffering? Do you become resentful and bitter? Do you take it like, in the case of these brothers, do you take it like a man? Do you carry your cross? Or do you grow bitter and resentful and seek to hurt the world and seek to hurt people around you rather than carrying that yourself. And some of the ways that this is explored within the interpersonal relationships, and the way that some of these relationships that have between siblings that have lasted for centuries deteriorate because of misunderstandings or because of very hurtful and wounding things that have happened to the different siblings, and how one is not able to understand the other. Brother is unable to understand the suffering that his sister has gone through, and the way that these deteriorate, and that these, even though they're immortal, that these siblings, the way that they hurt and hurt for one another and hurt each other, was one of the most interesting parts of this book to read about. Now, it's not all good. I'll mention a few criticisms that I had here. One was, and this problem might be entirely me, but I felt like this book was a little bit long. Now, for context, this is an e-arc. I was reading it on my phone, and I hate reading things on my phone. I despise it. And so it may have simply felt long to me because of that. Or it may be just a result of Dalglish's style. I really can't tell. So I'm just saying that for me, it was a little bit long, maybe 50 pages shorter. I really can't say, but that was just something for me. Also, I never felt strictly emotionally attached to the main characters in this book. I found them interesting, I found them engaging, I loved following them, I found the story very fascinating, but I never felt a sense of like being emotionally gripped by them. Now, that's true with a lot of books, and even true with many of my favorite books, but I do list that as something that might be a negative for some people. And then also, some of the timing in the book is a little bit unclear. I talked about the passage of time and how some parts go very long and some parts are very terse and very sharp, and so some of how much time exactly has passed wasn't always the most clear. But I'll say this, the ending of the book is shocking and very well written, and I would like a sequel now, please. And one of the things that Dalglish does with the character development, since I mentioned that a second ago, is that he doesn't give us very large like exposition dumps or telling us all the backstory of, for the last 300 years, here's what they've been doing. We just meet them in media res, we meet them where they're at in the story. And then as the story goes on, like an onion, gradually layers are revealed as the story goes on. And so there's critical pieces of information that we learn about some of the interpersonal conflicts between these siblings, between Farron and Serial, between, Serial and some of his sisters. There's critical pieces of information that we learn in the last 80 to 90% of the book. Pieces of information that change the way we've seen this character for all of the pages beforehand. And for me, that was really interesting, how Dalglish played with your assumptions and what you thought you knew about these people. And that really what came before defined a lot of who these people are. And that without that knowledge, our assumptions or what we thought we knew of them has been completely flipped and turned on its head by the end of the book. So, like I said, this book ends in a fantastic way, in a shocking way, in a way that makes me want to pick up the sequel immediately, which sadly probably won't be out for at least another year. But I really enjoyed this book. I will be interested to see what the greater reaction to this book will be, because the writing style really is atypical for what most modern fantasy is doing. Now, I think it's done very effectively, and I think that Dalglish is doing something very specific, but I don't know if it'll gel with everyone. But, as I said before, I especially think fans of Berserk, fans of Elden Ring should try this. Because there's enough here, there's enough crossover, there's enough where it's like they're playing in a similar ballpark, even if they're playing a little bit of a different game, that you should give it a try. If you like football, try rugby, sort of like that. So, I really hope more people check this out. I don't know how this book is going to do, but I'm very excited to see. And I thought this novel was excellent, and that there's a lot of interesting things that David Dalglish is doing here, and I'm excited to see where the trilogy goes in the future. So anyway, guys, this was my first time reading David Dalglish. If you have read this novel, let me know what you think. Please do pick it up at least, read the sample chapters on Amazon, see if it's something that interests you. The book opens with a very fascinating hook with the main character or one of the main characters of Farron being burned as sort of the ending of one life and the beginning of his next stage of his immortality. So that right off the gate is gripping and interesting. Like, what's going on? Because you don't understand what that ritual is for until later into the book. So yeah, read the sample chapters, see if it's something that interests you, and then if it does interest you, I know there's an audiobook for it, but yeah, pick up a copy. It's a great cover to have on your shelves anyway. But yeah, let me know if you've read any books by David Dalglish, or if you plan on picking this one up, and I hope that you do. Well guys, thank you so much for watching this. I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.